Is that better?
Yes, that is actually quite a bit better. That sounds great.
Great.
Awesome. So we will go ahead and get started. And thanks again for just taking the time to be with us. My hope is, if it's okay with you, to have the recording that I post to our YouTube channel later. That's cool. Cool. Awesome. So these are usually pretty casual and informal in terms of what we've been doing for the library. So my plan is I will just do a brief intro using the bio you have published, and then I will just kind of get into some questions and just have a chat with you. And yeah, so should be pretty good.
Great.
Awesome. So thank you everyone for joining us or tuning in. I'm Christopher. I'm your outreach librarian. And this is the first in our spring series of interviews with cool people who are doing cool things. And today we're going to be speaking with Eleanor Goldfield. And Eleanor Goldfield is a creative radical, journalist, and filmmaker. Her work focuses on radical and censored issues via photo, video, and written journalism, as well as artistic mediums, including music, poetry, and visual art. She is the host of the podcast Act Out, co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp, and co-host of the podcast Silver Threads, along with Carla Bergman. She also assists in frontline action organizing and trainings. So welcome, Eleanor. I wanted to ask you first of all, because I thought that was really interesting in terms of what you're doing and how you call yourself a creative radical. And I was hoping you might start by just kind of unpacking that for us a little bit, and what does that mean to you when you use it?
Sure. So thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so the creative radical term, it's actually something that I embraced relatively recently. I previously called myself a creative activist. And I've been in the sort of activist world since I was about 13. And started doing environmentalist work around that time. Then before the second Iraq war around 2002, I started doing anti-war work. And one of the things that felt like a hallmark of activism with a capital A is sort of the institutionalization of that, and how it's become sort of commodified, which really activism, if it is going to be at the core of the issues that we're facing as humanity and on a global scale, it really has to address the commodification of all things, which would include, of course, the commodification of activism and the nonprofit industrial complex and the charity industrial complex, and where, as Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out, like the well-meaning liberal has good intentions, but they get eaten up and they get twisted by these systems that at the end are there to uphold and preserve the institution of capitalism, the institutions of racism and sexism and imperialism and things like that. So activist became, to me, a word that felt a little bit too institutionalized for what I'm doing. Because while I really harp on, perhaps is a good way of putting it, while I harp on the importance of diversity of tactics, and I work with a lot of people who use tactics that I don't personally use, and I think that solidarity is important. I don't work within the system anymore. I no longer feel the need to petition power. So activist in that sense felt a little bit outside of what I do. And so radical, if we, I'm a word nerd. So the word radical, the etymology of that word is root. So the root of that word is root. And it felt much more applicable to what I do, which is really focusing on the grassroots, and really building solidarity and building alternatives in the grassroots. Because another thing that I feel is very, kind of perhaps cliche activist is to be reactionary. We're always back on our heels. We're always responding to something that the powers that be do, but we ourselves are not building alternatives. And something that A good friend of mine said several years ago when we were down in Louisiana fighting the Bayou Bridge pipeline was we were looking out over the bayous, which are breathtakingly beautiful. And she said to me, you know, you have to remember what you're fighting for and not just what you're fighting against. And that always sticks with me as a powerful lesson. You know, it's important that we're anti-racist, that we're anti-fascist, but what are we for? What is in that space of creation and what is in that space of building? And that to me is where radical comes in. What are these radically different and radically divergent and emergent worlds that we want to build? Like the Zapatista says, you know, I want a world where many worlds are possible. What are these worlds? And to me, that answer has to come from a radical space, which necessarily means it must come from the grassroots, but it must also come outside the confines of what we live in now and those structures that we live in now.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That and kind of tying in with that, like I mentioned it also in um, your experience of the creative portion of that as well, because you mentioned how it's important to remember what we're fighting for. And the sense I get just, you know, looking at some of your work is that art in its various forms is very much a part of that equation. So if you
Yeah.
just want to like maybe give us a little bit of insight into like that aspect, and also was it the art that came first for you, or was it the you know, the radicalism, the activism that came first, and when did you start to see them kind of intertwine?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in terms of art, I'll poorly quote James Baldwin here, but he wrote that, you know, only poets, and by that I mean all artists, can tell us what it means to be alive here and survive. And I think that's very powerful, and it's very powerful, like what art can do, not just in terms of it being a salve and a way for humans to communicate with one another without having to use, you know, statistics or you know, some more dry ways of communicating. Um, but it's also a way of thinking outside the confines, like I mentioned. So, for instance, one of the things that I will oftentimes use in a training, I'll say, like, the system will have you rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic as it's sinking. The creative will rush up and say, hey, why don't we make rafts out of the deck chairs? And it's that kind of thinking outside the box. Like, how can we use the tools that we have here? How can we use what's around us to create something different, to save ourselves and our communities? So I think that's a very important and oftentimes overlooked point about art. And some people think like, oh, well, we're getting rid of art classes. So what? They're not going to paper mache a globe. Who cares? But that's not really the point. Art allows us and pushes us to think outside the box of these preconceived notions and asks us to look at things differently. You know, I'm sure that everyone listening to this can remember like a concert they went to or an art piece or something that they interacted with that then when they went back and looked at something they had seen many times, they saw it differently. You know, that like just the way that you interact with the world when when you've interacted or when you interact with art, it changes paradigms. So I think that's an important thing to note. In terms of my own journey, I it's hard to say because I grew up with parents that were very. I mean, my dad marched on Washington during the Vietnam War. My mom is Swedish, and she did a lot of activism against nuclear power in Sweden, and then you know in the U.S. she did a lot of activism as well. And so I kind of grew up in that in that space. And I also remember when I was a kid, when I was like 10 years old, my father's a historian and focuses on the era from the civil rights movement back to you know pre-Civil War. And I remember when I was about 10, the KKK had threatened to kill my father and like burn a cross in our yard. He's Jewish, and you know I'm culturally Jewish. And I, you know, I just remember that happening and thinking, what a bizarre response to something you don't like. um, but so I kind of grew up with like in a very you know politically engaged space. Of course, we all grew up in political spaces because everything is political. But I grew up in a space that was very intentional about it. But in terms of art, I mean, my mom's an artist. And so, I remember looking through her art books and seeing things like Picasso's Guernica. And so I think those things happened kind of at the same time. But I think, with regards to the art, I was able to feel it on a much deeper level, and internalize the emotional response to politics that is really what gets people engaged, to move, to want to change things, is that emotional response. No one's going to get really fired up by looking at statistics. And this is nothing against statisticians. I love you guys. Think what you do is so important. But like the way that we humans respond to stats versus, seeing our home place destroyed, or, seeing like a movie like Get Out or something. The way that we respond to art is kind of like a back door to the human psyche. And so I think for me, growing up with that back door like fully open, most of the time, I think really internalized and deepened my drive to become politically active in a much more intentional way.
So thank you. So kind of looking at the other side of that, I wanted to ask something that I've been very curious about, just as someone who's just generally invested in the arts and humanities, and does creative writing and all of these things. I obviously I have like a lot of commitment to those fields and like the creative act itself. But I've also noticed kind of a tendency um, that I'm still trying to kind of work through, in terms of, I think people wanting to use art or film or books or whatever it might be, as a replacement for action, right? So if I read this moral book or watch this moral film, like therefore I am good person, problem is solved. I read this book, we've solved racism, and so on. So I kind of wanted to ask your opinions on that, and like at what point do you feel that action has to be part of that equation, I guess?
Yeah, I guess that, the question to that question is also what we mean by action, like, because I think there's this really powerful, speaking of art, there's this really powerful piece of art, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who did it, but it's a picture of someone throwing a gas canister back at the cops. And that person is very like, hard shapes and hard outline, but then sort of in like behind them, in the same, almost as if they were like echoes of that person, are like a whole slew of people. There's somebody doing childcare, there's a street medic, there's somebody who's focusing on the media aspect, there's somebody who's making sure that folks are fed and making sure that folks like have rides and things like that. So the idea being that there's one person that you see on like the news or whatever, but behind every person on the quote unquote front lines, there's a whole slew of people that are in support and solidarity. So I think it's important to point out that, like, I think a lot of people think that, oh, the only way that I can be active is to be on the front lines. No, that would be awful. That would that would mean that we'd have a bunch of people not taking care of the kids, not looking after elders, not making sure people are fed. Like, it would be a mess. So no, that's not at all the goal here. The goal is to create these networks and these spaces where everyone has a role and everyone feels engaged, um, you know, according to their need, according to their ability, right? So how can you contribute? And if you are an artist and that's the way that you contribute, that's super powerful. But I think, to your point, the person who's like, hey, I watched Get Out and now I understand what it means to be Black in America, check. No. um, I think that it's super, and I think this is part of also like the age that we live in. I've recently read a book called How to Do Nothing, and it's not actually about doing nothing. It's about extracting ourselves from that attention economy. The like, I have to be checking my phone. I have to be very, ADD on purpose, because that's what's productive. And the idea being that, we need to focus on what we're building, what we're fighting, And we need to really like sort of lost my train there, but but like with regards to the people who want to like check that box, I think there we go. I think that that really speaks to I have all these boxes to check, and that's productivity, right? And this whole journey, like this continuous work of being anti-racist, this continuous work of like of showing up for your community. It's almost like as if somebody could just be, I've parented. It's like, well, no, if you're a parent, then you're always going to be a parent. And there is no like, I did that, I'm done. And we should look at it at the same way as being in relationship with your community and being in relationship with your home place. And reinstituting the relationships that we have with our ecosystems and things like that. That's not a box you can check. And so I think that while it's super important that we engage with artworks, that we look for artworks that really speak to the issues of our time, that's not a box to check. That is just you know, you picked your kid up from school type of thing. Like, yes, I did that part of parenting, but I didn't parent. Like, I'm not done with that. And so I think it's just like a shifting of perspective of like how we look at these things and like why are we looking at building communities like it's a chore as opposed to this is what it is to be alive and this is what it is to be a human who has as our hierarchy of needs social interaction. So what does that mean in an anti-capitalist framework? What does that mean in an anti-racist framework? And really like having these deeper conversations which people can think are too time consuming or it's not productive. And I think that's that is part of the issue with like the attention economy, that like these kind of conversations and just like sitting on someone's porch and having a drink is not productive because it's not you're not creating anything for the capitalist economy. So yeah, I guess to those people, I would say, like, keep watching those movies, but there is no box to check, and, keep on keeping on.
Thank you. So you'd mentioned just the importance of kind of being in building relationships with community, and you also mentioned doing the same with ecosystems, and I feel like that's a good point to jump off into my next question, which was about your film Hard Road of Hope. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that film and how that kind of came about. What drove you to make this particular film, like in this particular moment?
Sure. So the film is about West Virginia, and I can just feel that some people watching this are like, whatever. Which was kind of my response the first time my friend came to me and said, I'm going to West Virginia. Do you want to come? And I was like, West Virginia? Um, And then, that's the problem, right? Is that when we think of West Virginia, if we ever do, we're like, oh yeah, that's upstate. Um, and we look at it as kind of like a throwaway. It's filled with throwaway people. It's filled with like, throwaway places that have been destroyed by coal and fracking and now the opioid crisis as well. And the point that the film makes is, first of all, that's not true. And second of all, if we were to throw away a place or a people because they had been propagandized and destroyed by industry, where would you have left? Not just in the US, but like anywhere? I don't know. So it was really a point to make that, yes, West Virginia can be a mirror held up to places to show destruction and corporate malfeasance, but actually it's also quite a mirror to show radicalism. And if you look at West Virginia's history, there's a lot of radical organizing, and you can see the trajectory that brought us a few years ago the teacher strike, that everyone was shocked, or not everyone, but a lot of people were shocked that it started in West Virginia. Like, oh, what's going on there? But if you look at the history, it's not that strange at all. West Virginia has a very rich history of labor rights and organizing across across like race and cultural lines as well, which folks would consider unusual in a place like West Virginia. So part of the part of the impetus for the film was just to kind of see if like how wrong I was. I was kind of curious. um And I had actually not intended on making a film. I had intended to go down there and get some footage for I had a TV show at the time, and then also, maybe write a couple of articles. But I realized that after I'd been there for like 5 or 6 days, this requires something a bit deeper. And I thought, well, there's this thing called a movie that is longer form that I could do, even though I've never done one before. But so I basically started researching, more about that medium, and I felt that, while of course you can never completely tell people's story in this kind of format, it was the best way that I could do right by the folks that I'd interacted with, and the best way that I could share that story so that people could see that microcosm as both a microcosm of like the bad, but also the beautiful, and of course, as the name suggests, the hope.
So you kind of mentioned how, like, part of the hope was to prove yourself wrong, right, about some of the preconceptions about West Virginia. Were there any was there anything you encountered, or maybe anybody's story that just really surprised you and resonated with you in a whole other way you weren't expecting?
I'd say like all of them, you know. um, uh, but I'd say that too. One of the stories that I thought was really special was the story of the word redneck. I mean, I grew up partially in North Carolina, and I always learned that you do not want to be a redneck. Being a redneck is this racist, small-minded, stupid, backwards, Confederate flag waving, the stereotype. And so I prided myself on not being a redneck. And now it's quite the opposite, because I learned where that term comes from. And in fact, that term comes from the mine wars in West Virginia, when mine workers tied the red bandana around their necks, basically as a sign of solidarity, and where mine workers, immigrant, black, white, all marched together, which was an incredible feat at the time, in particular, because they were stationed at different parts of the mine, and they did that on the mine. The coal barons did that on purpose so they could make sure that solidarity wouldn't grow. They'd say things like, "Oh, don't talk to the black miners; they're savages," and "Don't talk to the Jewish ones; they eat babies," or whatever. And so to cross that and to say, you know what, I don't actually think they eat babies. I'm going to go over there and talk to them because I feel like we have something in common, and then build together enough to the point where you are not just marching together, but you are firing at coal barons in order to demand basic workers' rights. That is heavy, and that is radical, and that is beautiful. And that's where the term redneck comes from. And so now I will proudly state that I'm a redneck. And the other thing about that story is it really shows like how twisted and how strong the propagandization has become, right? That we now look at that word literally like a 180 from what it was. And so that also speaks to the importance of bringing forward the past and making sure that we all remember the radical history of our home place and of other places that can prove inspiring and powerful in our future.
Yeah, and I think and I'm actually really glad that you told that story and that you have made this film, because one of the things that kind of resonated with me is because I grew up in like a small town in Oklahoma, like one of those 50s oil boom towns that went bust decades ago, right? I and so that very much saturated the culture, right? The idea of the redneck, as you mentioned, and that sort of thing. And so you looking retrospectively as an adult, like just looking back on the people I grew up with and realizing the common needs that were there, and the community that was there, right? And how everybody really wants mostly the same things, want clean water to drink, and we want to be taken care of when we're sick. We want a place to live where we feel safe and stable, and just the basics. And I think that sometimes we forget that, especially in the current moment where I think that's almost been, I guess you mentioned that idea of the redneck has kind of been weaponized in a whole new way, or at least it seems to be. So, and your documentary, it's won a few awards recently, correct?
Yes, it's gotten a few laurels from a few different uh, film festivals, not just in the States, but internationally as well, which I'm very honored that people are appreciating the story even outside the US.
That's fantastic. And if folks would like to watch it, where should they go to watch the film?
So the film is up at hardroadofhope.com, and you can find more information. There are trailers and everything up there. The film is available on a sliding scale, and if folks need extra financial assistance, just feel free to reach out to me via the contact page that's linked there as well. So yeah, that's all that information is up there. And also, if there are any like educators or any organizations, I've also been doing screenings with folks. So that's another option if folks want to use it as an educational or organizing tool.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I wanted to talk a little bit about how you got into podcasting, because you are either the host or the co-host of at least 3 podcasts by my count. So there maybe there are others. How did you get started in that kind of world, and how has there been anything about the medium that has surprised you or that you found particularly useful in terms of your own experience as an activist, a radical, a creative?
Yeah, so I mean, and you're right, it's 3. My mutual aid network is currently working on building a podcast, but I won't be the host of that. I'm just facilitating. So um but yeah, I mean, podcasting kind of came relatively naturally because I lived in LA for 10 years, and while there I worked in the music industry. Both I say on both sides of the glass, which means like I both worked in recording studios, and then I had bands and stuff like that. Um, and so I worked as a tech, and so I have like I have an understanding of audio and stuff like that. So the idea of creating in the audio medium was always, not always, but has been since I was basically like 18, has been like a natural space for me. And particularly after my TV show ended, I felt that I still wanted to put content out there in an audio format, and so the Act Out podcast just kind of made sense. And it just seemed that a podcast was like an easy way for folks to engage. And part of one of the things that I like to do is like figure out how is it easiest for folks to engage with the content that I release. And it seems like podcasts are just, they're having a good moment. I guess particularly now during the pandemic. But so the podcasting kind of came naturally, and it was relatively easy for me because I already had the skills to, edit the audio and do those kind of things. And it also just felt, it felt like a way to connect with people again in a way that talking into a camera can feel a bit rigid, but talking into a microphone feels a bit more. It can feel like you're really like in someone's ear. Not, I mean, you are of course, but figuratively speaking, like it can feel a bit more um, conversational and laid back. And so podcasting just kind of felt like like a natural progression of what I was doing. And also like, the 3 podcasts are different in what they cover. Common censored is more of like what's going on in the world from a radical perspective and from a leftist perspective, also like highlighting the need for media literacy. So when we read a headline, that says like dictator Maduro. It's like, well, he's a president, and why don't we call him that when we call Macron a president? Why don't we call Macron a dictator? That kind of stuff. But then also, then there's Act Out, which I say is like me and the nerdery, being like philosophical and talking political theory and stuff like that. And then there's Silver Threads, which is where the co-host and I talk to folks who have been doing this for a long time to just highlight that, like, hey, no one has all the answers, no one has that box checked, we're all still learning. So they all like they all take up different issues and different spaces. So yeah, I guess that's that answer. If that answers your question.
Yeah, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. And I kind of wanted to ask you, because you've mentioned like a lot of different things that are either kind of personally meaningful or meaningful in a political sense. I guess there's probably not much of a distinction there, but is there anything in particular, especially as we are moving ahead into 2021, you know, is there anything that you hope to be kind of more engaged with, or that is that feels particularly pressing and in need of focus as we kind of move forward?
Since the pandemic started, I used to travel quite a bit because one of my goals as a journalist was to do frontline journalism so that I'm not getting the hearsay. I'm getting like the actual story from the folks that are, on the front lines and impacted directly. And thanks to patrons and some great outlets that I work with, that was possible. Of course, pandemic not. And then I realized that I was stationary for a long period of time, perhaps more than I had been like in my life, because I moved around, I've moved around a lot. And I basically just had to like sit in DC. I'm in Washington DC, and I realized, okay, well, DC and I are gonna have to figure something out. We're gonna have to like have some kind of relationship now. And so I started organizing in DC. Um, and I had done some organizing here in the past, like for J20, which was Trump's inauguration, and some other things like that. But I had never really been here for a longer period of time, and so I started doing mutual aid last like March, I guess. When all of this started kicking off, and basically it was a way to not only like be useful and to take my skills deeper into the work of mutual aid like here in DC. Um, but it also became a way for me to know DC a bit better. And now I feel like when I walk down the streets, I mean, DC will never be my home. But the streets and I know each other now at this point, whereas before it was still a little bit like strangers in the night kind of thing. So that's been really, really good. And I also think, moving forward, having done mutual aid in the past where like there's like a hurricane, like I went down to Puerto Rico after the hurricanes down there, and it's very localized. It's like I came back to DC and everyone's like, "What hurricane?" But now everyone has the same problem, right? The crisis is global. So it's an interesting time for mutual aid networks because we're able to share tactics and ideas, and that solidarity has the potential, I hope, I hope it does, but it has the potential to spread globally and really confront and address the issues that we all share, which of course COVID, but underlying that, of course, is the crisis of capitalism, and the abyss that it's barreling us towards, regardless of the pandemic. So that's something that I'm continuing to be very, very focused on, and again with that sort of like grassroots radical perspective and that lens on it, like how can we have these grassroots localized building efforts to create better worlds and to to build a better future, while at the same time understanding the need to remain networked and recognize that we do live in a global space and a global time. And these are really exciting and sometimes frustrating and scary questions, but I think that we are answering them as communities, and it's really exciting to see that moving forward. And so that's something that I'm definitely focused on focused on currently. In terms of creative works, I am at some point in the spring going to release an EP, which I had intended to release in early 2020. But then I kept putting it off because I was like, oh, I'll wait until I can tour again. But that might be on the other side of never. So I'm just going to go ahead and release it, and yeah, and then little projects here and there, but that's kind of my the primary perspective is the mutual aid networks.
So thank you so much. So for those who are here, if you wanted to send a question in chat, I will pass it along to Eleanor. So feel free to do that if you would like. And while you're thinking of that, I wanted to ask you, and you kind of, it's kind of there in the title of your film, Hard Road of Hope, but to ask a little bit, in speaking of things like, mutual aid and, working within the community and just, activism or radicalism generally, I imagine that it can be very easy to get frustrated or dispirited or burnt out, right? In terms of what you're dealing with. So how do you go about finding that hope or that energy to keep at it and to keep working on the work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think like the problem that I think a lot of people assign to uh, activism or radical organizing is that capitalism tells us that we should always be happy, that your goal is to be happy. Well, that's creepy. That like only people without a central nervous system can have one emotion all the time. That's creepy. Um, I think it's more important to have joy, and the difference there, like to nerd out a little bit, like like what Spinoza says when he talks about joy is that like joy is not there in spite of the darkness. Joy is there because of the darkness. And joy is something that's a lot deeper, and you can have like a melancholy joy. You can have a joy that's jagged and rough and splintered. And I think that is, joy is like a full appreciation for life and how screwy and dark it can be. And I think, and Carla Bergman talks about this in her book, Joyful Militancy, which I wholeheartedly recommend. But there's a lot of like, I think, yes, you will burn out. Yes, you will get tired and frustrated, and you will have those days where you're like, everything's awful. We're all going to die. What's the point? And I think that like instead of trying to combat that, like we should be curious about those emotions and unpack them together, and or by yourself, whatever floats your boat. But not try to push them away, because I think if you are totally happy in the system now, there's something wrong. And so I think like instead of trying to like push towards a space where we don't get tired, where we don't get frustrated, let's make sure that we can try to mitigate the worst of those by showing up for and with our community, so that we can have that space where we can say, like, for instance, hey, I need to take a step back. I'm so like exhausted, I don't even know what my name is. And then some, like we have that space where if somebody steps back, nothing falls apart, because we don't have just one person holding the weight of a community. So I think that's kind of the core point, is like, let's just accept that it's going to happen, and let's try to mitigate it by creating those relationships. I really think like the core here is to have those relationships so that we can know that there's somebody that has our back, so that we can know that it's okay to feel exhausted, to feel confused, and also highlighting that sometimes there needs to be spaces where you can hash this out with people that you feel most comfortable with. Like, for instance, there might be a space for like femme and women only. There might be a space for only Black folks, or a space for only white folks to talk about like well, is anybody else feeling white guilt, or what does that mean? Let's unpack that. So I think like having these spaces is also important, and folks shouldn't be afraid um, to create those spaces if they feel it's needed.
Yeah, thank you. So you kind of spoken about the EP and what's next on the horizon for you. Are there any other mediums that you have not yet done a deep dive into that you are curious about exploring or tackling next?
I so back in 2019, I did my first art piece. Well, not my first art piece, but it was my first art piece that was in an exhibit. Um, and that was super cool. I really enjoyed that, and I would like to do more of that. I think I've had a harder time with that because my mom's an artist, and I can't even like draw a face. Uh, so I think I prematurely said that's not for you, Eleanor. And now that I'm older, I'm like, why not? Um, so I would like to dive deeper into like painting and visual art in that space. I do projections and things like that as part of my live shows, but actually like visual art that I've created with my hands would be very cool. But yeah, we'll see.
Um, so I I kind of wanted to ask about I, so your website where a lot of, or at least where I've seen a lot of your work hosted is art art killing apathy. And so I know you've kind of addressed it in some of your answers here, but I was just kind of curious what that means to you, what that phrase is, and kind of unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. So apathy to me is the opposite of empathy, right? Empathy is the our innate. I mean, it's a human thing, not just humans, but I'm saying as humans, I can't speak what it is to be a raven. Unfortunately, that'd be totally cool. But empathy is a very natural thing that we have, and apathy to me is the opposite. It's like the complete lack of care. It's not that you hate or you it's more dangerous than that, right? Because at least hate requires you to be engaged with something. um so and art again, like art is an emotional space. So you can't actually like have apathy in, in an artistic space. And that doesn't mean like you can totally be apathetic to certain forms of art. I know a lot of people, particularly with modern art, people are like, I don't, oh, whatever. So it's not to say that all art will always reach you, but art that does reach you, you can't feel apathetic about. You will feel something. And I want to take that, again, like a step further and talk about, okay, well, how can we push this feeling that you are now feeling due to that, poem or that movie or what have you? How can we push that to an engagement with, our ecosystems, with our political legislative mess? How can we push that to an engagement that will not only fight but build something better? And using art to do that as well, using art to think of the worlds that we want to create. And so really the idea behind art killing apathy is it's both like a statement that this is something that happens, but it's also a call to action. Like it is a call for people to either create art that pushes people to question things, to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, um, and for people to engage with that art and get uncomfortable and get kind of prickly with it and see where that leads us. Um, yeah, so that because again, like you shouldn't feel empathy towards everything, but to feel apathetic in a place and time like we're in right now is to me far more dangerous than just having like the quote unquote wrong politics. So I think it's really a matter of how do we reach people who just feel like screw it, there's no point in even caring. And I think at that point, no amount of trying to talk logic or whatever is going to help. I think it has to be something more deep and, more like human, which is that artistic way of speaking.
Awesome, thank you. We're going to wrap up here, but I wanted to give you the opportunity that if there was anything that wasn't asked that you were particularly eager to talk about or just dying to get off of your chest, to just give you, a space of a few minutes to just let us hear it. Whatever it might be.
No, I mean, I appreciate all the questions. They were really beautiful questions. I'd say like one thing that that has helped me, like when I've felt like I'm not sure how to enter this space, and I still feel that way, also because I'm an introvert and I don't really like people. I like individuals, but I don't really like people. Which some people might think like, well, how can you do what you do then? um, and I think like with regards to how do we show up, how do we, like, I don't know what I have to offer, I don't know how to start. I think the most important thing is just to like, what are you passionate about? I'm passionate about art, so that's my pathway in, right? Other people are passionate about other things. There are people who are really passionate about food, and so they show up in like the food sovereignty angle. And so I think it really depends on whatever it is that you're passionate about. Like, we need that passion. Because of course, like if we're trying to create a world built on justice and actual liberation, then we need everybody's passions. We need people to feel heard and seen and empowered. So, you know, I think it's important to like whatever it is that you're passionate about, that be your guide for showing up. So yeah, I just throw that out there as a little extra note, because I know that I still feel even having done this for the past like 20 years now, I still feel walking into some spaces, I'm like, I don't know if this is right. And then, of course, like another part of that is like, just accept that you're going to mess up. Um, and there will hopefully be people who can kindly let you know. And that we can all learn from that. But, don't try to be perfect. Don't try to, like walk on eggshells. Walk in, with like that clear cut passion and the willingness to be a part of that space. And I think that will come through. And yeah.
So thank you so much. I just want to say thank you again for taking the time and space to join us today and to just be with us and to share your thoughts and to be so just open and honest and everything. I think that was terrific. Tammy here mentions that you recommended a book earlier. Any others that you're passionate about that you want to share with us?
How much time do you have?
Well, we'll limit it to. I always feel like a list of 3 or 5 is always
okay.
Good.
Yeah, so I mentioned Joyful Militancy, which is a brilliant book. It's like a self-help book for, radicals or activists. So that's a really powerful one. Another one that I've been recommending recently, because it has a very strong mutual aid connotation, is Scott Crow's book, Black Flags and Windmills. It talks about his founding of the Common Ground movement in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina hit. And another good one is Revolutionary Suicide. I know it sounds like a scary title, but it's actually like a really rad book by Huey P. Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panthers. One that I just finished, which is also brilliant, is called Team Human by Douglas Rushkoff. And it's just a beautiful book that kind of outlines like, where we're at as Team Human, and the solidarity that we can and should build. And it's really it definitely leaves you with a lot of hope, even though a lot of the things that he takes up are not lovely. But it's a really great read. I recommend it.
Awesome, thank you. book recommendations are like catnip for librarians. So if we don't already have them in the collection, my guess is they probably will be with
Oh,
the week.
cool.
So if folks want to check out more from you and more of your work, where are some places they can go to seek you out?
Sure. So the film is up at hardroadofhope.com, and then everything else, I guess, is up at artkillingapathy.com, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Radical Eleanor.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. And thanks for everyone who joined us for the live portion. This video will be going up later, so please feel free to share it with students and friends and allies and all of that. So, so thank you again, and yeah, please take care, and we will see you later.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it. Stay safe, y'all.
Bye-bye.